Hello, everybody. The voice that you are hearing right now is from Christine Aguiar. I am the program manager here at the Little Compton Historical Society. And tonight we are joined by archaeologist Kevin Smith. I feel like I'm doing a radio announcement. It's wonderful. Kevin is, he's a wonderful person. I know him personally. And to start, he did his undergraduate work at Haverford College, his graduate work at the University of Michigan, and has been working as an archaeologist in the North for more than 40 years. And the only thing that gives that away is the color of his hair, not his youthful personality. Kevin most recently did some community stone tool identification days for us here at the Little Compton Historical Society and helped us to shed light on a number of super interesting things that we are very excited to be sharing with you in 2025. So without further ado, I am going to turn the time over to Kevin, and he is going to teach us all about Vikings in North America. Stay tuned. Oh, if you would leave your questions until we're going to talk about them in the end, but please feel free to type them in the chat if you have them. All right, here you go, Kevin.
All right, can everyone hear me? Yes, no, maybe?
Yep.
Okay, very good, thanks. Thank you, Christine, and also thank you, Marjorie. It probably shows her name underneath mine tonight. The part of Marjorie O'Toole is being played by Kevin Smith, me. And at least on this screen. I wanted to talk to you tonight about some things that we now know and didn't know a while ago about the Vikings in North America. The title of the talk, can anyone see that now? I'm looking at it.
Just share screen.
Right. I think it's here. And here.
Oh, there you go. We got it.
All right. Let me know if you can see that. I can't see anyone else. Okay, perfect. So the title of the talk at 40 years later really refers to the fact that about 40 years ago, 1984 to be precise, two Canadian archaeologists named Bob McGee and Marie Rousselier wrote what still remain the two best summaries of archaeological evidence for the Vikings or the Norse in North America. Don't worry, I'm gonna see if I can. Here are their papers, and don't worry, I'm not going to make you read them all, and I'm not going to try to read them to you. I just want to give you a sense, these are they, and this is being recorded, so anyone who wants to go back and find them, that's the name of their two papers. Now, 40 years later, I'm working on a paper to discuss what we know after 4 decades of work by colleagues of mine and others across the Atlantic, including to some degree work that I have done with my wife, Michelle Hayers-Smith, and with a group of our international colleagues. And tonight I want to preview some of that paper with you before I publish it. Throughout this talk, I'm going to be using the terms Vikings and Norse interchangeably. I want to just give a little background to that. Really, Viking is a title for a job description. It means a raider or a trader, basically, who were members of communities and kingdoms that spoke versions of a language that we today call Old Norse, which is the language that gave rise to modern Icelandic, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and also the term Norse gets used for the people who spoke those languages in the past, not so much the way it's thought of today. Now, our story begins with a massive migration of peoples from mainland Scandinavia, primarily Norway, and eventually from settlement areas in the British Isles that were occupied by the Norse, initially by Viking raiders and then by Norse colonists, beginning in the late 8th century and accelerating through the 9th century AD. Viking raids began in England, at least the ones that we have records of, as you probably know, in AD 973 with an attack on a monastery called Lindisfarne. But by 800 to 820 already, Norse settlements were already beginning to expand across Scotland, the islands north of Scotland, into Ireland, Sometime around 820, migrants who were trying to reach Shetland are said to have moved even farther out into the Atlantic to the Faroe Islands, which are there between Iceland and the Northern Isles of Scotland. And by 860 AD, they had reached Iceland. Again, the stories that written down in the Middle Ages always attribute these to storms and people being blown off course. And you'll hear about that over and over again. Now, Iceland at the time was completely unoccupied, and it was then rapidly settled as a big island with a lot of good farming land. By 930 AD, all of its available land had been claimed, and as many as 10 to 20,000 people had already settled there by 930 AD. According to medieval Icelandic sources that we'll talk about here in a minute, in 985 AD, a man named Eric the Red, who had come to Iceland with his father because of some killings in Norway, he was exiled from Iceland, again, for some killings. And he decided to sail west because every time people sailed west, they found new lands. And in doing so, he discovered Greenland. He was there for 3 years, returned to Iceland, told everyone what a great place it was. And actually, southern and western Greenland are much like Iceland, even though inside it's all ice. He encouraged a group of settlers to colonize the southern tip and the western coast of Iceland, where 2 settlements were developed in the south, one called the Eastern Settlement, and a bit farther up the west coast, one called the Western Settlement. Now, these were home eventually to 3,000 to 5,000 people or so, Norse settlers with Eric the Red at the beginning as their chieftain. The Icelandic sources indicate that Eric's children, seeking adventure and opportunities to establish themselves and become chieftains in their own right, decided to establish colonies that they could run and continued to search for lands to the west, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, there are 2 main sources of information that we're going to be discussing. I'm going to be kind of weaving them together. On the one hand, medieval Icelandic documents that were written about 150 to 300 years after the events they describe, and archaeological remains that were produced at the time that these events were happening. The 2 types of sources are not entirely easy to pull together, but they form a really interesting couplet that we can work with. In addition to the Icelandic sagas that I'll mention a bit more about, there are also some annals from the 1300s and 1400s that get into the later part of the story we're going to talk about, but they have relatively small anecdotes on a year-by-year basis. Now, the 2 main documentary sources about the voyages to North America are together called the Vinland sagas. And I'm just going to grab a couple things here. We'll show and tell. The Vinland sagas are easily available in Penguin versions. A nice thin book, 2 different sagas, gives you a lot of information that you might not have already heard about before. The sagas of the Greenlanders, as you can see here at the top, was written down at the end of the 12th century, a bit more than 150 years after the events it describes. And Eric the Red saga, which is also sometimes called Guthrid saga, after a woman who's a really fascinating character, central person in that saga, that was written about a century after that, but between 1265 and 1300 AD. Now, both of the sagas tell more or less the same story, but their details and perhaps the reasons that they were written down make them differ in ways that often makes their interpretation complex. And an example of that can be seen here, where the Greenlanders saga, the earlier of the 2, describes 6 voyages or attempted voyages to the New World, while Eric the Red saga, written about 100, 150 years later, boils that down to just 3. You have to remember that when people were writing books in the Middle Ages, it required a lot of investment, a lot of money, a lot of cows that had to be killed to make the vellum. And that also meant that people were able to pick and choose what details that they wanted to put in there. Now, both sagas describe several voyages, I said, to and from North America, and give names to the locations they found. According to the Greenlanders saga, the earliest one here, you see Eric the Red's voyage from Iceland. According to Greenlanders saga, the land in the west was first discovered by a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had gone to Norway on a trading voyage. And when he got home, he encountered the nightmare of almost every child in the world, and that is that he got back to Iceland, found that his parents had moved to Greenland and left no forwarding address. So Bjarni sailed off, and he got blown offshore by a storm, as it says, and he discovered a land to the west that didn't look anything like the Greenland he'd been told about. And so he coasted along for a little while and turned north, went back, and eventually found his family. Yay, that's great, except he became the laughingstock of all of Greenland because he had discovered new land to the west and hadn't even bothered to go ashore to check it out. Both sagas then relate that Eric's son, Leif, or sometimes Leif the Lucky, heard about Bjarni Herjolfsson's discoveries and decided to go out and look for them himself. He sailed north up the west coast of Greenland, came across, and he found a land that was frozen and rock covered, and he named it Hetleland, which in Icelandic or Old Norse just means flat stone land. Traveling down the coast farther, following it into warmer climes, he found a land that was covered with massive forests, something really interesting for people in Greenland and Iceland where there were no forests. And he called this Markland, which means forest land. The Icelanders are nothing if not very direct in what they name things. Continuing farther down the coast, he came to a land which was much more verdant, much more a place where one might want to settle. And he called it, after having supposedly found grapes in some part of it, Vinland, which means wine land, or the land of wine. Now, both sagas further describe a base that Leif Erikson set up in Vinland called Leif's Búðir or Leif's Booths. Sometimes it's called Straumfjörður. It may be same place or different, it's hard to know. They built this in Vinland during their first attempts to explore the lands there as a place that they could come back to as a base. And they describe a second site called Hope, which means glacial lagoon or tidal lagoon, where they tried to establish a colony that only lasted for 2 to 3 years. Both of these sagas were well known in Iceland from the 13th century onward and were maintained in written form right up until the 18th century, but they were only translated into English and other languages in the early 1830s, after which a rush began either to discredit these sources because everyone knew Columbus had come to the Americas first, or to try to find out where these sites were. With all of that being the prelude, I want you to think of the archaeological evidence for Norse engagement with North America as a play in 3 acts, with Act 1 beginning where the sagas just took us, on voyages from Hetleland to Vinland. In 1960, Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian adventurer, diplomat, and it said spy, along with his wife, Anne-Stine Ingstad, who was an archaeologist and a Viking Age archaeologist, set sail from Greenland, trying to follow the geographic clues that were in the sagas to see if they could find out whether Vinland was real and whether they could find any evidence of where it had been. Sailing across from Greenland, following the same directions that were in the sagas, they encountered Baffin Island, which they felt matched the descriptions of Hetleland. Then south of that, the coast of Labrador with massive forests and long beaches described in the sagas that they thought fit well with the sagas' descriptions of Markland. And then coming a bit farther down south, they came to the northern tip of Newfoundland at a tiny fishing village called Meadows, which seemed to fit the description of the place where the Vikings exploration base was built. Now, others had come to Meadows before, trying to find out if this was a place that could have been part of the sagas. But unlike them, Helge and Anne, who was an archaeologist who knew what to look for, asked the local people whether there were any lumps and bumps in the nearby landscape that looked like they could have been the foundations of houses and places that people lived. They were taken almost immediately to a location just a kilometer away from the village, where Anne immediately recognized the signs of a group of turf-walled houses built according to the styles and architectural traditions of medieval houses from Iceland and Greenland. Recognizing the possible importance of the site, the Ingstads assembled an international crew of archaeologists from Norway, from Denmark, from Iceland, from Canada, some from the UK, and began excavations at Meadows in 1961. After several years, they revealed a settlement with 3 large halls, which you can see on the left-hand side there marked F, A, and C, I believe. I can't see it on this one. As well as 4 smaller buildings, a semi-subterranean building where iron had been smelted from local bog ore, and they recovered a material culture assemblage of objects that clearly showed that this was a Viking site in North America. In 1968, it was registered as a Canadian National Heritage Site, and Parks Canada has continued excavations there from the 1960s to the present day. In 1978, it was declared the very first UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, from the very beginning, it was assumed that all of the structures at the site were probably contemporary with one another, but aside from apparent differences in the activities that were done around each hall, there was really no firm evidence to suggest that they all represent one voyage, and several people have suggested that based on the styles of the houses, maybe they represented separate voyages at different times over the space of several generations or even several hundred years. Birgitta Wallace, the archaeologist who has spearheaded all of the work at Lonesome Meadows since the 1970s, however, has argued cogently that this site was too far north to be Vinland, and she instead thinks it represents an exploration base that was maintained at what she calls the gateway to Vinland. Now, due to the site's potential importance for documenting the first European contact with the Americas, Lonesome Meadows is often simply described as the only documented Viking site in the Americas, as if that's all it ever was. However, work done by the Ingstads and more recently by Parks Canada shows that Lonesome Meadows was a place of importance for First Nations or Native American people for at least 5,000 years before the Norse arrived and for at least 500 years after they left. So rather than being a Viking site that Indigenous First Nations people visited, we now know 40 years later that it is more appropriate to think of this as a Native American specialized hunting and possible ritual site that the Vikings temporarily disrupted, rather than as a Viking site. Excavations by Parks Canada have revealed a vast number of seasonal campsites all across the terraces and the old beach lines around Lonesome Meadows. And the red dotted lines here document some of the most intense concentrations of prehistoric or pre-colonial Native American or First Nation sites. And in fact, these are the ones that were occupied just before and just after the Norse arrived. Interestingly, while the terrace locations where the Norse built their houses have been used previously by Indigenous communities, there's no evidence that the ancestors of the people who were there, the Beothics, as they were called when Europeans arrived in the 1700s, 1650s, 1700s, there's no evidence that their ancestors who reclaimed the site immediately after the Norse departed ever used or reused the standing architecture that the Norse left behind, even though in this windy terrain, the standing walls would have provided good shelter from the storm for at least 100 years. The site's buildings were built with strong turf walls, and here in the green, you can see the mounds that are left around one of those halls. Turf wall construction was a very important part of the adaptation of the Norse architectural canon in the North Atlantic to keep houses warm, a little bit like the houses that pioneers built on the prairie, with walls up to 1.5 meter thick, made out of blocks of cut turf. And Anstein realized right away that this is what they were. So the buildings were exactly right, but the material culture recovered also included a bronze ring-headed pin that you can see down here at the bottom, of a kind that's found throughout the Viking Age North Atlantic and was probably made in the Irish town of Dublin in Ireland. There's a spindle whorl over on the lower right, made out of soapstone, probably from the Shetland or Norway. There's a whetstone there of Norwegian schist, and evidence on the left lower portion of a hut where iron was smelted from local bog ore, something that was not a part of the material culture technology of any Native American or First Nations groups at this time, but using furnaces of a kind which are exactly the sort that we see in Iceland. So this all proved without a shadow of a doubt that the Vikings had come there. But there was another find, however, that gave some suggestions of where they had gone. And that was during Parks Canada's excavations in the watery bog adjacent to the site, they recovered 3 butternuts and a fragment of butternut burl wood that had been carved with iron or steel tools. On the face of it, that doesn't sound like very much. Okay, a couple of walnuts and a piece of wood. But butternuts are a member of the walnut family that reaches the northernmost limits of its growth, and did so 1,000 years ago as well, only on the north shore of New Brunswick, around Quebec City, and on the along the southern coast of Maine, which you can see those areas circled in red here. Implying, because butternuts and butternut wood are both too heavy to be carried by water, by the ocean, by the tide, that these had to have been carried there, and the burl wood has the traces of being cut with metal tools, implying that from L'Anse Meadows, they had gone as far south as the places where butternut wood could be found. The butternuts and the butternut wood were found in the locations where you see the green dots and triangle here. But other information on the movements of the Vikings, however, came from a series of jasper fire starters that were recovered inside and around Norse buildings. In 1997, when I was attending a conference in Newfoundland, Birgitta Wallace asked me if I would be interested in analyzing these jasper fire starters, after having heard a paper that I gave about tracing where a jasper artifact in Iceland had come from. Fire starters are probably the ugliest, honestly, and the least studied objects we recover from Norse archaeological sites, but also one of the most common of them. And they are what's left after a piece of jasper, flint, chert, or obsidian has been struck with a steel striker like this one, using this as a piece of flint or steel. In deference to the folks here at Little Compton Historical Society, I'm not going to strike it to actually create sparks. We don't want to have that excitement. But if I was to strike this, you eventually get damage and wear patterns that look like the piece on the screen, which came from L'Anse Meadows itself. Now, the reason I find these of interest, despite them being ugly, small, not at all very pretty, is that these were literally the matches in the pockets of the Vikings. And because of that, they turn out to be really valuable clues to understanding their movements. Much like the scenes in old film noir movies where the detective finds a pack of matches at the scene of the crime that leads him back to the place where the victim had been before that, in this case, the Hotel Vesta in Poughkeepsie, New York. If we can trace the rock from which L'Anse Meadows fire starters were made back to the places where that rock is found, we can use them to trace where the Vikings came from and potentially also where they went. We've used several methods to do this, including instrumental neutron activation analysis that requires the use of a nuclear reactor, so you can't do it at home, and a faster non-destructive technique called X-ray fluorescence using the instrument that's seen here, which literally is a ray gun that looks like a phaser. It was designed to look like that. Both techniques work by bombarding the object with a ray of neutrons, which then provide quantitative data on the elements that are present in the rock and their quantities. And since different geological sources formed at different times and in different places from different materials, their unique geochemical signatures can be like fingerprints, to keep going with the film noir metaphor, that link them to samples from known locations. Here, for example, is one graph produced by using X-ray fluorescence on a fire starter that I showed you just a few minutes ago. It's the red dot up on the upper right-hand corner. And we also did it on a range of samples of jasper from Iceland, which show up in blue here, Greenland in green, and from different locations in Newfoundland, which are the yellow icons. In this case, the ratios of just two elements, vanadium and scandium, show that the fire starter in red is unlike any of the samples from Greenland or Iceland, but falls within a clear cluster of values from 5 known geological sources in Newfoundland. When the locations of those sources are plotted on a map, it shows that the most likely place that the jasper for that fire starter originated was in a narrow belt along the southern edge of Notre Dame Bay on Newfoundland's north coast, 1 to 2 days due south of L'Anse Meadows. Without boring you with all of the graphs I could possibly show you of all the analyses we've done, after analyzing all 11 of the jasper fire starter fragments, we found that 4 of them, all from the largest hull at the northern end of the site appear to have come from Greenland. 5 more match 2 source areas in Western Iceland, and they have no matches in any material from Newfoundland. And 2 of them, in red here, came from that same Notre Dame Bay region on the north coast of Newfoundland. These small, overlooked objects confirm not only where Lonzo Meadows residents came from, but also gave us the first clues to somewhere else that they had explored from the site. Their distribution also mirrors remarkably a description from the sagas that one of the voyages to Vinland was made up of one ship with a mixed Greenlandic and Icelandic crew, like that hull in the north with Greenlandic and Icelandic Jasper, while the other 2 crews were manned only by Icelanders, a bit like what we see at Hull D and Hull A, where we have only Icelandic Jasper. And so the Jasper sources surprisingly match that too well for any archaeologist to feel comfortable about, but it is what we have. In addition, we were able to refit 2 of the fire starter fragments, the Jasper ones here at the top, which showed us that the analyses we were doing showed that these should fit together, and bango, they actually did, which made me feel really good about the analyses we were doing. And then we had a close geochemical source between these 2 fragments at opposite ends of the site that really made us feel that these were probably from the same fire starter that had been used in 2 halls, but we couldn't fit them together. So it didn't give us that key information that we needed to understand how the site was organized or whether these were all contemporaneous places. In 2017, some years after that, with funding from a crowdsourcing site, my colleague Chris Wolf here and I went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the collections from Lonzo Meadows are stored. Over time, I'd realized it was possible that Birgitta had thought the only things that we could work on using this technique were Jasper fire starters, and maybe that's all she'd given us. So I wondered whether there might be other fire starters in the collection made from chert, which is a flint-like rock, that it might have gone unnoticed, but could potentially give us more clues to where the Vikings had sailed. To make a long story short, we found 11 more the very first day we were there, doubling the number of the matches and pockets that were known from the site. All of the new fire starter fragments were found within the Norse structures and their adjacent middens and work areas, dumps and work areas. And these were clearly, therefore, not elements of Native American assemblages that came before or after the Vikings had been there. Unbelievably, 4 of the fire starter fragments could be physically rejoined, even though they came from different halls. So here's 2 that were black in color, very distinctive, fit together, snapped back together, connecting these 2 areas. And here's a greenish one that connected these things with physical refits on objects that you can only use for 2 or 3 years. It definitely showed us for the very first time that all of these halls were contemporary with one another, and that this really is, as had been hoped and thought, a unified site rather than parts that had been reoccupied over a long period of time. Further, all of the halls refit to Hall F, the largest hall, and the one that had the most diverse archaeological assemblage, that Birgitta thinks is probably the hall that belonged to the leader of the expedition. And most importantly, all but one of the fire starter fragments could be traced reliably to sources or areas in other parts of Newfoundland, providing new information on the site's Viking Age occupants' movement. Pulling all of the fire starter data together, half of the fire starters from the site, all in Jasper, showed that the Norse came there from Iceland and Greenland. And the distribution of the Jasper fire starters, as I said, mirrors the descriptions of crew composition in Eric the Red's saga. Another quarter of the fire starters from this site document the Vikings' knowledge of the resources within the distance of a day's sail out and back along the coast of the northern peninsula, these mustard-colored ones at the bottom left in the pie diagram. But the final quarter of the material document previously undocumented voyages southward to the area of Notre Dame Bay on Newfoundland's northern coast, and also down along the west coast of Newfoundland towards the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and from there potentially towards the areas where the butternuts grow. Interestingly and frustratingly, one of the reconstructed fire starters is made from a type of chert that we have not yet been able to identify anywhere in Iceland, definitely not Greenland, definitely not Iceland, definitely not Newfoundland, at least places we know. And it probably will eventually give us a clue to yet another area that the Vikings explored from this relatively amazing site. So in sum, the fire starters document something we didn't know 40 years ago. They give us a fairly detailed knowledge. They tell us that the Norse had a fairly detailed knowledge of the resources within 45 kilometers of Lonzo Meadows. They knew even places that are extremely hard for geologists to find, to go and gain new matches to use to make their fires. Suggests more than a passing knowledge of the region and potentially quite a few years of time spent there and getting to know the area. Also, the use of raw materials shows us they traveled 200 to 250 kilometers down the west coast of Newfoundland and also to this area in Notre Dame Bay directly south, with a number of different materials from different sources there, suggesting this was a place that they knew more than casually, that they had been to quite a few times, because none of these sources of raw material to make these fire stars from are easy to find. And we also know now that these are very different choices of raw material than the native people were using throughout this time period. As I mentioned, 2 or 3 of the fire starters, possibly 4, appear to have come from the Notre Dame Bay region. And archaeologically, this is the core area with the red dots that you see there, are all sites of what's called the Beaches phase, or the ancestral sites of the Beothic people from about 1000 AD, are all concentrated in this area, whereas the people who were traveling down the west coast would have been finding areas that seemed to have very little occupation at this time. This suggests to us that Notre Dame Bay region is a likely choice for the area where the first contacts took place ever between Europeans and Native Americans 1,000 years ago. Again, something that we did not know 40 years ago. So the chert fire starter refits demonstrate that all of the hall complexes were contemporary, that this was one large site with short occupation, not many reuses, and that people traveled to and from it to other parts of the New World, primarily in and around Newfoundland. But when did this actually happen? The sagas suggest it took place around 1000 AD, maybe until about 1020. But the dating there is relatively rough, and there's a lot of preconceptions and concepts about how that might fit. Archaeological evidence is harder to come by because, for a large number of reasons, the wood that has been found there has been difficult to date. But estimates of the dates for Lonzo Meadows' occupation have generally been based on Eric the Red saga statement that Leif Erikson was charged by Norway's King Olaf Tryggvason to convert Greenland to Christianity around 1000 AD. And there's been an assumption implicitly that Lonzo Meadows must be one of the places in the sagas. But again, that's not demonstrated. And as I say, the radiocarbon dates have been difficult. But last year, the results of an incredibly innovative analysis were published that give us precise dates on 4 pieces of wood that you can see here from Lonzo Meadows. These are 4 pieces of wood that were clearly cut by steel tools, and they come right out of the bogs. Now, globally, it's been found that there was an extreme solar event in the year 993 AD that created a unique signature that's identifiable in radiocarbon levels around the world. And this signature was found in individual tree rings within 3 of these samples that you see here, the ones that are actually surrounded by green, blue, and red boxes. And they showed that that tree ring could be dated to 993 in each of these pieces. By counting outward ring by ring from that ring to the bark rings on each of these pieces, it became clear that all 3 of these pieces of wood were cut down in the spring of 1021 AD. So that shows us at least 3 pieces of wood out of 4 that were found had been cut in 1021. Does that change anything? Well, the dating of the voyages and the sagas have always been somewhat uncertain, and this only changes things by shifting our dates maybe 15 to 20 years later than the internal chronologies had suggested, or simply suggested that the site might have begun in the 1005, 10,000 range, but 20 years later, someone was there cutting trees down. So at most, it could imply that the few voyages described in the 2 sagas weren't the only voyages that were made to Lonzo Meadows. And in other words, the existing sources may only have told the stories that they wanted to tell for the reasons that they needed, that the people who wanted to write them down had to talk about. They may not be a complete record of everyone who went there around 1000 AD. But the next question that has to be addressed about L'Anse aux Meadows is, if it was occupied around 1021, when was it abandoned? This was never quite clear until 2008, when archaeologists from Parks Canada excavated a hearth that you can see here in the upper right in one of the protobiothic campsites about 80 meters northwest of Hall A. 2 radiocarbon dates on charcoal from the hearth suggest that it dates before about 1040 to 1050 AD. And it contained a nail, actually a rivet, from the Norse site that had come out while one of the ship's timbers or something else from the site was burned, implying that by 1040 to 1050 AD, the houses were in a state where they were being dismantled and the wood was being burned as firewood by native community members on the shoreline. The conclusion appears to be that L'Anse aux Meadows is established before 1020 AD, that the Norse were there through the summer of 1021, but that it had been abandoned and the site reclaimed by the ancestors of the Beothic by 1040 to 1050 AD. Act 1, therefore, extends from perhaps 1010 to 1040 AD. That leaves the question, what caused the Norse to abandon Vinland? I won't read all of these for you, but basically these are all from the Vinland sagas. They're descriptions of, in the case of one, a great swarm of boats was heading toward them down the fjord. The Skraelings, a Norse term for the native people in North America, shot at them for a while, and Thorvald died. Early one morning, they caught sight of 9 skin boats. In the spring, they saw boats approaching from the south. There was no sign of natives for 3 weeks, but then Karlsefni's men saw a huge number of boats coming from the south. The Skraelings came right to the place that Karlsefni had chosen for the battle. There was a fierce battle. This terrified Karlsefni's men, and they retreated. Karlsefni's men now realized that although the land was excellent, they could never live there in safety or freedom from fear because of the native inhabitants of the land. And in the spring, Thorfinn Karlsefni, the leader of the attempt to colonize Vinland, announced that he had no wish to stay there any longer. And at that point, they left. The Norse sagas are very clear that the reason that they left Vinland and left it behind and decided never to try to colonize again was because the native resistance was too strong for the Vikings to resist. Act 2 is a short one. It's based on just one artifact and documentary evidence for the spread of knowledge in Europe about the lands to the west. So if Act 1 was about exploration and attempts at colonization, Act 2 is about the spread of information about all of that, and perhaps efforts in Europe to act upon it. The single object in question is a fragmentary silver penny that was found in 1957 during the excavation of the Goddard site, a late woodland Native American site near Blue Hill Bay in Maine. The coin was found by an amateur archaeologist and was initially thought to be an English coin, perhaps from the early colonial period, and it received little or no notice until after it was donated to the Maine State Museum in 1974. In 1978, after pictures of it were published, it was eventually identified as a Norse silver coin from the reign of King Olaf the Quiet, or Olaf Kyrre, who reigned in Norway from 1067 to 1093 AD. Questions have been raised about whether it was planted at the site as a hoax, either by the finder or by somebody else wishing to show that the Vikings had reached New England. To date, that question does remain unresolved. However, in 2017, the Norwegian archaeologist Svein Guldbeik, who is one of the premier scholars of Norse numismatics, looked at the site and was able to discover that it is a type which is extremely rare, even in Norway. No examples of it found anywhere in the North Atlantic, and none of them have ever appeared, as far as anyone can tell, on the antiquities market. It's been argued, because this, when it was found, was very fragile, but it had a hole in it, so it was perforated to use as a pendant. It's been argued that this had been brought down from L'Anse aux Meadows through trade networks by native people. But we now know that this was not even minted in Norway until 50 to 60 years after L'Anse aux Meadows had been abandoned. So we have to think about what else do we know from this time period. And we know some interesting things from the documentary record. First of all, the first references to Vinland, this land in the west of wine and grapes, wasn't written by the Icelanders. It was written by Adam of Bremen, a member of the Archbishopric of Bremen in Germany, in 1065, in a book that he was writing for the Vatican about the history of the Archbishopric in Bremen. And he was writing about it for a very good reason, and that is that the papacy was deciding that they were going to break up the Archbishopric of Bremen, which had control over all the churches of the North Atlantic at the time. And Adam was making a case, no, you can't. We really know what we're doing here. And he wrote in there, when he's describing all the lands that the Archbishopric had its fingers in, that the Danish king, Svein Estridsson, who reigned from 1047 to 1076, spoke of an island or country in that ocean discovered by many, which is called Vinland, because of the wild grapes that grow there, out of which a very good wine can be made. Moreover, grain grows and sowed there abundantly, and this is not a fabulous fantasy, but is based on trustworthy accounts of the Danes. This account that he's writing in Germany in 1065 without knowing what's in Maine is the exact same time as the Maine penny. He gives it the source of his information as the King of Denmark. He's writing it in Germany for the Archbishopric of Bremen, for the Pope and the Vatican in Rome. We know from the Icelandic sagas that the Thorfinn Karlsefni, who led that colonization effort, is said to have gone from there to Norway, where he traded with the King of Norway. So there's a whole series of reasons to think this was being discussed there at the time. Adam of Bremen's mention of wild grapes and wild grain is mirrored in both of the Icelandic Vinland sagas as well, and has set off a growth industry over the years of people who use those clues to locate where Vinland must have been. Since the northernmost locations where wild grapes occurred on the Atlantic seaboard were around the border of Maine and New Brunswick and around the city of Quebec in Canada. So these statements have been used to argue that the Norse must have traveled and settled farther south along the coast of New England or Quebec, with, as you can see in this drawing done by an Icelandic scholar trying to figure out different places where Vinland must have been thought to be. People have reconstructed the voyages to go as far south as Manhattan, the Bay of Fundy, a whole series of different places. In fact, in the 1830s, Narragansett Bay was thought to be Vinland. And Mount Hope, where Brown's property is, where the Hafenreffer Museum is, was thought to be where Thorfinn Karlsefni had established his base. We know it isn't the case, but that's what was thought. So the issue of the wine and the grapes has really been an important part of people trying to decide where Vinland must have been and where it must have gone, how far south people must have gone. On the surface, the reference to grapes and grain seems straightforward and has posed a lot of questions, and perhaps it's worth asking, though, why Adam of Bremen, writing a history of the church for the Vatican, would single out grapes and grain among all possible things to highlight why Vinland was important. Because remember, the Icelanders are not saying this at this time, only he has written it down. In that ecclesiastic context, where he's writing for the Pope to talk about why his church should continue to hold all the lands to the west, including Vinland, you have to say, what else could be made from grapes and grain? The bread and the wine of the Eucharist. It is a typical aspect of medieval stories to talk about the miracles that existed in the world that would explain, in this case, that the key ingredients for Christianity's most important sacrament grew wild in a place without Christians. This would signal, in a medieval mind, have been seen not only as a miracle, but as a divine signal that the church was meant to expand there, and that this region should be under the church's oversight. And in the context of Adam's writing, it's clear that he implied that these new lands should be under the control of his church, which had authority over both Iceland and Greenland, and areas to the west, he was arguing, until 1104 AD. The genealogies of in the Vinland sagas at the end, which are the last bit in each of the sagas to talk about how do, who was the people who went to Finland were the fathers and mothers of these people, these people, these people, these people. They also show that they were written after 1164. And they described that the people who settled in Vinland, the heads of the expeditions to colonize there, were the ancestors of all of the bishops of Iceland at a time when the Icelandic church was now arguing that it should be in charge of everything to the west. So again, this suggests it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't wild grape, that there were wild grapes or wild grain, but you have to be thinking in a medieval text about the agenda that was being written and who was writing it. And I would argue that it's quite possible that the arguments to be made are that the wine and the grapes and the grain and the bread that can be made out of it are metaphors and talking about the miracle of this place being meant for the church and meant for a Christian settlement. So the point of all this is that the context in which Adam of Bremen's statement and later sagas representations are may not be good to help us find where Vinland is. The sagas weren't written to give us roadmaps 1,000 years later to figure out where they had gone. They were written for a specific purpose in the past. And that past meant that with all of the sagas references and the things that we know, that by about 1100 AD, we know that aspects of Vinland were being talked about and discussed in all of the places that you can see on the right-hand side, from the Vatican all the way up to Norway, and probably in other parts of the world. There's, in other words, a point right before 1100 AD when we have a penny at the Goddard site and evidence that people across Northern Europe and across Europe, in the church particularly, had their eyes turned towards the west and may have been thinking about what was out there. It's possible that the penny at Goddard is there from someone who is trying to find Vinland, because that's about where the northern grapes, northernmost limits of grapes grow. At the same time, around 1100 AD, the Crusades began, and Europe's eyes turned resolutely to the east, and Vinland seems to have been forgotten. Act 2, therefore, ends around 1100 AD. Even though there's an account written by an Arabic scholar in Sicily in 1150, which describes the way people lived in Greenland and talks about areas to the west. That sort of takes us on our way off to episode 3 or act 3 of this play. Can you still see this? I'm having a little trouble.
I can see Act 3. Yeah.
Good. Okay, now I've got it. Act 3 is about evidence for continued interactions between the North and North America's people and its resources from the 12th through the 14th century. In that paper in 1984, Bob McGee opened up discussions about these interactions. And since then, there have been numerous claims that scattered bits and pieces of Norse material culture scattered across the northern parts of North America, the Arctic, provide the first indications of really intensive or extensive face-to-face interactions between the Norse and North America's indigenous Arctic peoples, or that they simply show evidence of shipwrecks, hostilities, and scavenging from Greenlandic farms. Act 1, as we said, covers the span of time that is related to the settlement and the abandonment of Meadows in Newfoundland in the south. Act 2 was represented archaeologically only by the Goddard site penny from Maine and by the textual references to Vinland across Europe at the end of that same century. Together, these all appear to encompass the span of time over which the Icelanders, the Greenlanders, and other Scandinavian powers were interested possibly in exploring, exploiting, or settling in North America. But what of Act 3? Act 3 shifts the focus to the North American Arctic, where the Greenlandic Norse colonies were growing in size from the 11th to the 14th century and were expanding their presence along the coasts of Greenland, making annual hunting trips up along the west coast of Greenland into areas far to the north where they were able to hunt walruses for their ivory, which could be traded for king's ransom in Europe, and which was the source of almost all of the ivory that was used in medieval churches and medieval castles and by the nobility and the royalty across Europe. and narwhal tusks, the tusks of those amazing Arctic whales with long spiral horns that come out of them, which in medieval Europe were considered unicorn horns and were incredibly valuable and were used as symbols of royalty and also to prevent poisoning by dipping the tip into a cup of anything that you're drinking. In addition to this, they were taking out of these areas called the Northern Setter, or the northern settlement areas, falcons that were being sold as far away as Baghdad and eventually to China, as well as polar bear cubs, which were taken back to European monarchs as symbols of the most amazing thing that you could ever find. The Norse also built a series of structures along the way, including this area called the bear trap, but it's probably a storage area halfway up to the hunting zones to store things on the way back, and left behind the only rune stone ever found anywhere in Greenland or in Iceland, in the whole North Atlantic, before the 13 or 1400s AD. This was found at the north and is basically a help message. We were here, we sort of were starving, hope somebody finds this. And it was put into a cairn up above a very lonely place. Every 5 or 10 years or so for the last 50 years, archaeologists working across the Eastern Arctic have found pieces of Norse material culture in sites of both the Paleo-Eskimo Dorset culture. The sites of those are here in blue. These were an Arctic people that preceded the ancestors of the modern Inuit. They came also from Alaska and ultimately from Siberia around 4,500 years ago, and disappeared around 1300 AD, as well as in sites of the ancestors of the Inuit, here in red, who expanded out of North Alaska and the Bering Straits region, beginning around 1100 AD and reached the high Arctic of Canada by about 1250 AD. In all of these sites, there have been fragments of Norse material culture across an area which is really quite vast. The distance between where it says Thule Inuit and Dorset Paleo-Eskimo, if we put that across the eastern seaboard of North America, of the United States, would stretch from the northern coast of New Brunswick all the way to Florida, and from the east coast to the Mississippi River. So these pieces of Viking Age or medieval material culture are spread over a vast, vast area, and all date to the period 1200 to 1350 AD, suggesting levels of interaction that we don't quite know what to make of, but extending over a very vast area. And there's a lot of mystery about this. There are not a lot of archaeologists working in those high Arctic areas, and the sites are very hard, very difficult to excavate, very expensive. So as I say, every few years a new piece comes up. And they give us some sense of different things. For example, here from a Dorset Paleo-Eskimo site is a typical Dorset pendant, but made out of copper, which came from Northern Europe. Here in the high Arctic on 2 Thule sites are, on the lower part of a broken balance beam of a Norse trader, the sort that was used in most of the Norse world to weigh out amounts of silver for purchases or in legal transactions. And above it is a piece of a bronze cauldron, and several of those have been found in the north. From a site called Skraeling Island, right up at the point where Ellesmere Island practically kisses the Thule district of Greenland, have come pieces of chainmail, pieces of Norse textiles, wool textiles, carpenters' plane mat of oak, and a whole range of other material from this very early site, one of the earliest sites that we know of the ancestors of the Inuit in the high Arctic. And it has this mass of archaeological material. And from the southern coast of Baffin Island, this evocative small statue of what has been interpreted in the past as potentially an Inuit image of a Norseman with a cross on his chest, potentially of a cleric. And it's sometimes been called the Bishop of Baffin. But what we've learned over the space of 40 years doesn't really fit all of these things. And also there have been additions to the repertoire. In 2004, Bob McGee's wife, Pat Sutherland, began arguing that at these sites that have blue dots and the blue triangle beside the Bishop of Baffin, that she had found evidence, additional evidence of the Norse presence in other Dorset sites, in particular at a site, the triangle there beside the Bishop of Baffin, which is called the Nanook site. She argued that the Nanook site had enough material in it, especially twisted fibers, that this was actually most likely to be a second Viking site in North America, a place where the Vikings or the Greenlandic Norse had established a trading base or a location on the south coast of Baffin Island, where there were interactions with the Inuit for a period of time, or at least with the Paleo-Eskimo Dorset. The original work at Nanook, and this is what the site looks like under excavation, the initial work was done here in the 1970s by an archaeologist called Moreau Maxwell, who argued, he had no question that he just thought this was a standard Dorset winter village site. However, Pat Sutherland argued that it represented, as I say, a Norse Greenlandic base on the basis of what she interpreted as another Norse turf-walled structure, and a series of other things, including a possible a crucible, stone crucible up there on the upper right, a series of whetstones that she argued must be Norse, even though the Dorset used ones just like it, because she said that there were traces of these being used to sharpen bronze or copper tools. And the biggest argument that she made, not only to connect the Nanook site to the Norse, but all of those 4 or 5 sites were pieces of twisted thread or yarn, like you see here in the lower right. There's some problems with all the arguments. Although there are crucibles for making non-ferrous metals, bronze and silver and gold across the Norse world, there is none anywhere that is a stone crucible like the one she's shown. But these were very common in the 16th century when there were attempts to mine gold in the northern parts of the Arctic, only about 150 miles away from this. The whetstones are just like Dorset whetstones, and the copper traces are really hard to interpret as Norse because the Norse didn't use copper knives, axes, or swords. They were an Iron Age people who used iron. The largest piece of evidence that Pat brought forward about that this was a Norse site and that these were places where the Norse had been in contact with the Inuit or the Dorset Eskimo were the pieces of twine, and they were spread across this area here. And she argued that the evenness of the spun cordage from these sites and the fact that it's made from fibers that are difficult to spin indicates the work of experienced artisans, suggesting that European women were in Hetlaland, or does it mean that local Dorset people had become expert at using a foreign technology? She argues, in other words, that the technical aspects of spinning cordage from Arctic animals' fur was too difficult for any indigenous person to have figured out by themselves, which is a bit of a strange explanation given that they'd been spinning sinew for thousands of years. And she thought it was impossible for them to have developed on their own, and therefore they must have learned it from Europeans, thus therefore documenting that Europeans had educated the indigenous people of the Arctic in new ways to use their locally available resources. In 2017, as part of my wife, Michelle Hager-Smith's project looking at textiles all across the North Atlantic, and I urge you to buy her book, which is called The Valkyrie's Loom, Weaving and Women's Power in the North Atlantic, AD 900 to 1900 AD. I have to give the plug. It's a great book. It just came out in paperback and also as an audiobook. We went through and collaborated with a Norwegian colleague named Gurid Nielsen to redate a whole bunch of these pieces of yarn from across the Canadian Arctic. And the dates that we've given, sorry, this is very geeky, but those weird squiggles that look like hats that people sat down on are the distributions of the dates of that we got back on these things. So at the bottom one there, the squishy hat sits over about 1 BC, 1 AD, saying that's when that piece was spun. All of these line up 1,000 years to 200 years before the Norse even arrived in Greenland. So the argument that these represented a technology that was taught to indigenous people by Europeans can be thrown out of right away. And the idea that indigenous Arctic people didn't know how to use their own resources is actually the easier argument and the one that makes much more sense. So we can get rid of that. We also wound up having to redate some textiles from the site at Archaeologist, which is where this figurine of the so-called Bishop of Baffin had come from. And when Michelle looked at the textiles that had been found right over this figure, she looked after having worked on 18,000 pieces of textile from across the north. She took one look at them and said, these aren't medieval, these are 16th, 17th century. And when we ran the radiocarbon dates on them, again, here's the squishy hats, kind of look like two hats, but they all date, the dates here in red for the Archaeologic textiles all line up in the 15 and 16, early 1600s, and are identical to the dates from William Frobisher's site from 1576 to 1578. Frobisher was an Englishman sent over by Queen Elizabeth to try to find gold in the Arctic. He went back 3 years, 1576 to 78, had his base only 135 miles from this place. The dates on his oak are the same as the dates on the textiles. And he had 2 ministers with him in 1578. So it's quite possible this is an image of a late medieval or a medieval cleric, but it's unlikely at this point that it has anything to do with the Norse, and probably has more to do with Frobisher's expedition in the 16th century. So if we take those out of the picture, we wind up with an image of Act 3, still of a fairly intense amount, an unexpectedly large amount of material culture from the Greenland Norse sites across the Canadian Arctic, but pretty much now in 2 groups, one up in the high Arctic around the space where Greenland and the Canadian islands come together, and another smaller group around the edges of Hudson Bay, in just around the tree line, which is what those little trees there, the northern limit of tree growth. We don't know what to make of these beyond that. It's still early days, but it begins to give us a sense that from about 1200 to 1350 AD, there was interaction going on, possibly in 2 parts, but more intensively in the north. Until 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have said that's the end of Act 3. There's nothing more to be known, and that's pretty damn cool. Sorry about that, that's very cool. And then a couple of years ago, friends of mine, Veronique Forbes and Paul Ledger from Memorial University of Newfoundland, went back to Lonso Meadows and began, they're people who look at insect remains and environmental remains, pollen, etc. And they were looking in the bogs to try to get information. And they found a compressed layer of peat in the bogs there that dates, again, these squishy hat things, between about 1200 and 1400 AD, that's full of wood chips and other compressions that they're tentatively arguing might represent another European period of European activity at Lonso Meadows, 200 to 400 years after the Norse had abandoned the site. Now, it's fair to say that at this point, they got a great article out of it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, but there are no artifacts from the site. There's nothing to indicate that this is actually a place where Europeans had been cutting wood. It could have also been the Beothic people. They've been supposed to get back in the field and do some more work there for a few years. COVID got in the way. They were supposed to be in the field this summer. I believe they were, but we have not yet heard the results. So stay tuned. It may indicate that Lonso Meadows was a place that was still known, and people still came back there at a different point. Again, that would have seemed kind of improbable because we didn't get a sense anyone was going anywhere south of Hudson's Bay or Baffin Island at this point. Again, until just this past year when another colleague of mine, Elisabeth Gudmundsdottir, published a paper in the journal Antiquity that looked at work she's been doing on the wood that was used in sites in Greenland, including 4 farmsteads in the eastern settlement area, in the Western settlement area, and at the cathedral, the medieval cathedral site, which you can see the ruins of here in the upper right-hand corner. They were once massive stone buildings built out of red sandstone that's there locally at a place that was then called Gardar. It's now called Igaliku. Wonderful place to go if you have a chance. And she looked at the wood that came from these places, and she found wood from two species that only grow in North America, among many, 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 many other pieces of wood that are driftwood or that came from Europe, oak and others, and beech that were used to make certain tools. But there were material from two North American species, jack pine and hemlock, all only found at the cathedral site in Gardar. We know that the cathedral owned one of the only ships that still existed in Greenland by about 1300 AD. And there were a few more pieces in the early phase, including both jack pine and hemlock, but there was also jack pine in greater numbers after 1300 AD. The import of this is that when you look at where these species grow, and you can see that better than I can because you folks are all sitting over my side of it. On the left, you can see where jack pine grows, eastern hemlock grows, and the butternuts that we saw before. And the circles there on the right-hand side show the areas where the overlap of these species occurs. And they occur again in northernmost New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, and around the city of Quebec in the south, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, implying almost certainly that there were people continuing to go into this area as late as 1300 to 1350 AD. This is not entirely surprising to us, perhaps because there were two medieval records in two of those medieval Icelandic annals that I mentioned, both for the year 1347, where they describe a Greenlandic ship that had gone to Markland and was blown off course in 1347 and came ashore in Iceland. So the documentary record from 1347 matches up pretty well with Elizabeth's work here, suggesting that there may not have been constant interaction with the North American continent as late as 1347 or 1350, but there definitely was some. And just again in 2021, an Italian historian named Paolo Chiesa, I probably am pronouncing that wrong, pulled out a piece of information from the 1340s, written by Galvano Fiamma, in his Chronica Universalis, written in Milan, who describes again what's in the north. And he says that northwards beyond Norway is Iceland, and further ahead there's an island called Grönlandia, which he describes, and he gives a really pretty good description of what we know about how people lived in Greenland, even though it's very short. And even though he says you don't speak loudly or make any noise for fear of huge white bears that swim in the sea. But he says that there are white falcons there capable that are sent as far away as China. All things that we know to be true. And below that, he says, further westwards, there's another land called Markalada, obviously Markland, where giants live. And in this land, there are buildings with such huge slabs of stone, nobody could build them except huge giants. They're green trees, animals, quantity of birds, but no sailor was ever there to know anything for sure about this land or its features. There are in northern Labrador large stone buildings that were made by people even older than the Dorset culture, 6,000-year-old structures of the maritime archaic people, which are big long houses built out of big stone. So he's clearly gotten some stories of people who've been off there to North Atlantic, in the North Atlantic to North America. And this tells us once again that even as late as 1325, 1350, there was still knowledge being circulated that was relevant to the knowledge of North America as far south as Milan and the Vatican, who Fiamma was writing for again as well. So with that, we're at the end of Act 3. And I said it was going to be a 3-act play. And Act 3 was about evidence for continued interactions. And we could end the story there, but it begs the question, what happened next? And that calls for an epilogue. and frankly, a change in the cast of characters. The last information that we have about the Norse colonies in Greenland come from two written sources. In 1341, a representative of the Catholic Church was sent to Greenland from Iceland. And when he arrived at the Eastern settlement down in the south, he was asked by them to go north because they had no ships that could take them there. Maybe one of them had been blown offshore to Iceland, I don't know. So they had no ability to go there, and they wanted him to go find out what was going on in the Western settlement because no one had heard anything from them for several years. He reported back that when he arrived, he found no live Norse Greenlanders, no one alive or dead, no one anywhere to be seen, just some of their livestock wandering around randomly, around abandoned houses and farms, with signs of the Inuit everywhere. The Western settlement was never heard from after that time. And the last information that we have from the Eastern settlement comes from 1408, when two Icelanders who had come there on a ship from Iceland were married on September the 16th, 1408, at this stone church, which was in better shape at the time, on the western coast of Greenland at a place called Kvalsey, or Whale Island. They returned that year to Iceland, arriving to an island that had been devastated by the Black Death, which killed up to 50% of the population of Iceland in between 1401, 1402, and with recurring bouts over. We think we just went through a pandemic. It was nothing compared to the Black Death. An Inuit tale recorded by missionaries in the late 1700s also talks about Kvalsey, using their name for it, but they describe it as a site of a battle in which the Inuit defeated and killed the last of the Greenlandic Norse, right here. Now, we don't tend to think of the Inuit being a warlike people, I think most of us. But at the time that the Inuit began to expand eastward from North Alaska and the Bering Straits, those areas were already engaged in endemic warfare using sinew-backed Asiatic bows with arrows tipped with bone, ivory, or stone that could penetrate chainmail or plate armor. These are incredibly strong bows. And the Inuit themselves in that area, or Inupiat as they call them in that area, were wearing full suits of bone, antler, or ivory armor and were engaged in serious warfare by 1100 to 1200 AD. We don't know if that's why the Inuit took off to the east. We do know that they didn't carry with them any evidence that we found yet of bone-slat armor, but they were armed to the teeth with bows and arrows that would have at a distance been able to outdistance anything the Norse had. And even though we think of the Vikings as fierce people, a steel sword does you no good against an arrow coming at you from a great distance. And there are very few swords, if any, known from Norse Greenland. This is a farming colony, not a warfare, not a site of a lot of warfare. So I've described the interaction of the Norse and North America as a three-act drama, with the exploration and attempted colonization of America's coast during the early 11th century as Act 1, increasing knowledge of those lands to the west and possible expedition to see what else was there in the later 11th century as Act 2, and continuing with interaction and voyages from Greenland to Arctic Canada, or some level of interaction of sorts we don't quite know, perhaps as far south as northern New Brunswick into the 14th century. However, seeing all of this as the expansion of Europeans westward really misses the point, as interesting as that angle is. In every case, from Vinland to Greenland, Europeans were pushed back. And the real story of conquest and success in the Arctic is the expansion of the ancestors of the Inuit, who spread from northern Alaska to cover all of the North American Arctic, including Greenland, and down the coast of Labrador by 1500 AD, where they continue to live today. And by 1450 AD, while there were no Norse left in Greenland, all of that area, all of the area in red was occupied by Inuit. So, did it matter? That's the question we always get. If the Norse were only in Meadows for a few years, for a few decades, Did any of it matter? That question is almost always asked and answered from a Eurocentric perspective, meaning if the Vikings didn't colonize North America and left, it really doesn't matter because it didn't change European history, like Columbus's expeditions did 500 years later. So this is just an unimportant footnote and a curiosity in history. And on the one hand, yeah, that's true. But regardless of, from a European perspective, that might be true. But regardless of whether it changed the course of European history, this was the first time that humans were in contact all around the globe, from one side to the other. 60,000 years after, some members of our species went westward to Europe and others spread eastward across Asia and the Americas. So from a global history of humanity, it's a really important point. But when seen from a different and more inclusive perspective that takes the histories and lives of all of the participants in the encounter into consideration, that conclusion changes significantly. Native Americans, First Nations peoples' resistance to the Norse efforts to colonize Vinland around 1000 AD pushed back European colonization of the Americas for 500 years. Regardless of the numbers of people involved, it is clear from the Norse sources themselves that they left Vinland because they were outmatched. And it's clear from the 14th century accounts in Greenland that, again, they were losing. They lost the Western settlement without even knowing it. And 100 years later, there was no one there. The Inuit colonization of Greenland and the disappearance of the Norse there between 1350 and 1450 also importantly severed all remaining ties between Europe and the Americas. Why was this important? Not for Europe. It was important for the Americas because it means that the people of the Americas, an entire hemisphere, were spared all of the pandemics that ravaged Europe and Asia before 1500 AD. Had there been established colonies, Norse colonies in North America that were in contact with Europe through that time, the bubonic plague from 1346 to 1353, which killed 75 million to 200 million people, would have easily come into the Americas. And we know that other diseases that came to the Americas in the 1500s and 1600s killed 85 to 95% of the Native American populations that were affected by those diseases as they had no resistance. In addition to that, the Black Death in Iceland, like I said, 1401 to 1404, killed half of the population there. A second plague hit Iceland 90 years later, killed 50% of the remaining population. And then there were constant waves of influenza, smallpox, chickenpox, other viruses throughout this period of time. What it means, more specifically, is that 20 generations of people across an entire hemisphere got to see their children grow, be able to love them, watch them develop into adults, watch them have their own children and grandchildren, and to develop their own cultures and all the civilizations that we know across the Americas, undisturbed by disease-driven mortality, colonization, enslavement, and dispossession of their lands for 500 years. Had diseases hit the Americas before the Norse arrived? Cahokia in the bottom, the Inca Empire, the Aztec, the Pueblos of the South, the development of the Wampanoag and other peoples of Massachusetts and New England that we know would have been totally different, and especially would have been ravaged most likely by disease, if not by colonization, like we saw at a later point in time. So that's the end. I want to give thanks to all my colleagues who've done hard work reported here. And they include Birgitta Wallace at Parks Canada, my wife, Michelle, who's like me, an Arctic Studies Center research affiliate at the Smithsonian, and others here, as well as to those at the labs that have allowed me in to work on some of the material and who've shared their kindness and their ideas with me. And with that, I know we've gone a bit over time, but it's a long story with a lot of people involved. And I would be happy to take any questions that anyone has. Right. If I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Ah, you got it. All right, so our first question came from Paul Johnston, and he asked, so there are no parallels anywhere for the Goddard coin or the iconography on either side?
No, Paul, thanks for the question. There are parallels to it. In Norway, it is obviously a penny of the emitted by Olaf Kier. But numismatists are remarkably nitpicky types who look not only at specific variations in the ways that the dies were carved to create individual coins, but really down to the minutiae of how many times those dies were struck. And Svein Goldbeck's article goes into some detail that I can't because I'm not a medieval numismatist, and he studies in his entire life. The specific details of that coin, it appears to be a very limited strike done by probably from one set of dies for a very short period of time amidst the range of coins that were done. And so that's his argument, is that that particular style, that particular variant is extremely rare. And because in Norway, anything older than I think 1550 AD is property of the state and property of the crown, and Norwegians are remarkably good, lawful people, they tend to report everything that's come in, and there are only a handful of those coins known anywhere. Across the entire North Atlantic, I think there are no coins of that sort, and maybe no coins at all. In Greenland, in Iceland, the total number of coins that have been found archaeologically before the 19th century is, I could hold them all in one hand. It's maybe 20. And there are maybe one or two. These were non-monetized economies. If you were to read my wife's book, which is called The Valkyrie's Loom, Weaving and Women's Power in the North Atlantic, and I highly recommend it, what she would tell you, as all of us have known, but she's really documented in greater level, is in Iceland in particular, there was so little silver after about 1000 AD or maybe 950 AD that the currency became woven cloth. And the cloth was woven into long bolts that were then traded overseas, and you could actually pay your rents, pay your tithes, pay your tribute with bolts of cloth. So these are societies which were involved in a very complex set of barter relationships. They had a very clear sense of currency and values, but it was really more a matter of cloth there, and we don't even know in Greenland what they were using. We do know what they were using to trade overseas was walrus tusks and pieces carved from them, and that was most likely currency there as well, but that might have been even more of a farming economy. I hope that answers the question.
So Judith Rapping had not a question, but a comment. She said that she already has a copy of Vinland the Good, the Saga of Leif Erikson.
Okay.
And she said that she will now reread it with much more care and skepticism.
Like any medieval source, it really has to be, when you read the Icelandic sagas, if you do, and I recommend them. They're great reading. They are the novels of medieval Europe, written in the vernacular by non-clerics for the most part, although the Vinland sagas clearly are, they have their genealogies as a part nobody reads because they're boring. Like nobody reads the Beatitudes, or not the Beatitudes, the Begats at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, because it's just seemingly unimportant. In that case, it actually traces Jesus's lineage all the way back to David, which was important. And in the case of anything written in the Icelandic sagas about the genealogies, they're hard to read, they're boring, but they tell you why the agenda, why that thing was written, who was the audience, who are the patrons, whose story was it that they were telling you about. And when you realize that, and when you realize that these early sources, whether it's in Bergen or whether it's, in Bremen, Adam of Bremen, or the others, you have to realize these are sources which are written by and for, or at least representing the church. And it may be the descendants or the other family members of those bishops in Iceland wanted to get their share of it. They're trying to say this is land that was ours. This is where the first European child in North America was born, Snorri Thorfinnsson in 1003 or 1005, and it's his descendants who are the bishops. So they're claiming this land as well, but through the bishoprics. So that's probably it. So I do endorse reading them, and I endorse the skeptical nature of it as well, especially when you get to the part of the Unipeds who, jump across the land. There's fabulous aspects as well.
Carol Albright says they sailed west. They didn't seem interested in sailing south, where the land would have been warmer. Any reason that you know of why?
I think it's a good question if you know that there's more land to the south and that it would be warmer down there. It's also really important to realize that the distance between Greenland and Newfoundland is farther than the distance between Greenland and Norway. These are long voyages that are putting you well beyond the level of comfort. Had you established a base in Newfoundland where people were living on a regular basis, or in New Brunswick, if that second Viking settlement that they talk about in the saga is called Hope, not hope as in I hope we'll be able to live here, but hope as in a tidal lagoon, as Icelandic term, then maybe they would have gone farther south, but you have to kind of know that there's something down there that's warmer that you want to go to. And it seems clear from what they're saying that by the time they got to Newfoundland or the Gulf of St. Lawrence, it didn't take them long to realize that there were a whole lot of people there, hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands times more people in this continent who really weren't all that thrilled by having them and didn't necessarily, think this was a great idea, especially when you came in and you settled and you put these big halls right in the middle of one of the most important seasonal hunting spots for birds, which is what Lonso Meadows was. And for the Beothic people and their ancestors, birds were sacred beings. It probably, to use fruity language, it pissed them off, is what I think happened. And also the Vikings, the sagas are also very clear in the way they write about it, that before they had seen any other indigenous people, they came to a place where they found a bunch of them sleeping under an overturned skin boat. And without thinking twice about it, they went and killed them all. So the Norse were not, they were there exploring, and they were, probably nervous as well. I don't want to put myself in their shoes and whatever, but they didn't behave well. They kind of behaved like Vikings, I hate to say. And it didn't work out well for them because there were just a lot more people there. So I think that's part of the answer. Why they didn't go farther south. They may have gone farther south. As I say, probably at least as far south as where butternuts and hemlock and jack pine grow. But everything, all that evidence from Greenland is literally 10 wood shavings or 10 fragments of wood. So it's not a whole lot. We're not talking about very much.
Several comments of thanks. Excellent presentation. Thank you for sharing your research.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for telling the saga from different sides, and amazing. Helen Richmond asked, do you have an opinion on the Spirit Pond rune stones supposedly Norse discovered in Phippsburg, Maine?
I thought they were in Massachusetts, but yeah, I thought that would come up. Probably. There are a number of rune stones around New England that have been discovered. Narragansett rune stone, one at a place off of Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard called the No Man's Land rune stone. 2 or 3 others, and the Spirit Pond rune stones. So a few points. One is that there was no record of them ever before the Vinland sagas were translated into English. And Carl Gustaf Raffen, who was the translator of them in Denmark, when he translated them into English, he was curious about New England. And so he sent copies of the book around to all of the antiquarians here in New England, especially in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts, to ask them whether there were any evidence of the Norse in their area. And surprise, surprise, as soon as this new story got told, Norse objects began to appear all over New England. And things that were, for example, a Wampanoag leader's grave that had been found in Fall River was interpreted as a knight in armor. And that inspired William Longfellow to write a poem that became a fad poem, like he was the Taylor Swift of his days, the poet laureate of the United States, wrote this poem called The Skeleton in Armor, in which he posited that there was a sort of wayward Viking girl who was being badgered by a suitor that her father didn't want her to, to have a whole lot of interest in, and she did. So he did the only thing a Viking father would do. He shipped her off to the New World where no one lived, built a tower in Newport, put her in the tower, and kept her there until her Viking lover came. Honest to God, you can't make this up. You can read it. Her Viking lover came across and tried to get her, but was killed by an arrow, and apparently, according to Longfellow, rode off or dragged himself off wounded until he died in Fall River. I think a lot of people died in Fall River, but this one was with an arrow rather than an axe. So there are a lot of these things around. That's one thing. I've been asked to go see quite a few rune stones in New England, and the issue is always the same. Oh, you really have to get there quickly, because I was there 10 years ago, and the runes have been they're always at the shoreline, and the runes have all been eroded by the sea. To which my question is, why didn't the sea erode them for the previous 1,000 years? To which there's always a bunch of made up explanations. And the easier one is that they're probably, and also most of them, if not all of them, including the Spirit Pond runestones, have letters on them, runes. Runes are letters. There are two runic alphabets, one from about 400 to 800 AD, and the other one from 800 to 1200 AD, called the older and younger Futhark. Futhark is just the letters of the beginning of the runic alphabet. And these New England runestones always are a mishmash of runes from both of these different alphabets, because the younger Futhark doesn't have letters that we need in English or think we need. So it's kind of like somebody deciding today to write something and making getting out some stuff, and they don't know really, or 1,000 years from now, they don't know our alphabet. So they find some Cyrillic from Russian, and they find some English lettering from here, and they mash them up and say that's it. So that's kind of weird. The other thing is, imagine yourself on a boat with 30 or 40 other people in a land that you don't know, with potentially hundreds, thousands. You don't know how many other people are around. Is the first thing that you're going to do to come up to a big boulder by the ocean with a hammer and chisel and start whacking away to write your name in there as loudly as you possibly can on what might well be a sacred stone by the ocean, which is where a lot of the coastal Algonquin people had their most sacred places? It's probably not a sensible thing to draw attention to yourself like that. Whatever. The final piece of evidence is runestones. 19th century and 20th century Americans knew all about runestones. They're really cool. They assumed they had to be all over the North Atlantic. I have here in my pocket a full life-size copy of the only medieval runestone known from anywhere in the North Atlantic. It's this big, the size of a Milky Way bar. And it's from the 1300s, not from 1000 AD or 1050 AD, when the Vinland sagas are supposed to have been there. I don't know if you can see, there's the runes. And those are all Greenlandic runes of the 1300s, an evolved runic set. And some of those show up in the New England runestones as well. So again, if runestones, even in Scandinavia, runestones are a Christian tradition. They're not an old Viking tradition, and they mostly date after 1000 AD. Because they're memorial stones, they're gravestones, they're monuments. So if they aren't in Scandinavia before about 1050 or 1100 AD, they aren't anywhere in the North Atlantic. You didn't carve a runestone by the shoreline to show people, hey, this is my house. Then why would you come to North America and expect that you have runestones all over New England when they're nowhere else? It just doesn't make sense. New England, after the Vinland sagas were published and became popular, especially in the 1920s and the 1930s, 1940s, into the 50s, there came to be a whole lot, not just runestones, but also Thor's hammers, swords, axes, all of these things found across the area. Well, I can tell you, I've worked in the North Atlantic for 35 years, excavating sites in Iceland, Greenland, and working on the material from Alonso Meadows. Alonso Meadows might have been occupied periodically for, let's say, 20 years. The full range, except for those little fire starters, the full assemblage of objects from it is about 12 objects. That's normal. I mean, you excavate a Viking Age or medieval site in Iceland or Greenland, these people were recyclers extraordinaire. They would take their axes, turn them into knives, their knives into needles, their needles into tiny little things, melt them down, turn them into something else. You just don't find swords. You don't find axes. You don't find Thor's hammers. And again, Thor's hammers disappeared after about 1000 AD when the North converted to Christianity. So again, I think what we wound up seeing is that when New Englanders got a taste that there might be a story that Europeans had been here before them, and that they could turn that into a story that maybe these Europeans had been in New England before the native people, because there was no chronology at that time. They could make a story for themselves that this was a European land, and coming here in 1620 and getting rid of the native people by 1690 wasn't such a bad thing, because it was really just coming back to a place that was their own. So there's some interesting aspects in there, but whatever the point is, people got fascinated, and the more fascinated they got, the more Norse things that they found that have nothing to do with it. And the most obvious example of this is the Newport Tower at Newport, which shows up in the 1600s as the governor's stone mill at the top of Mill Street, which seems kind of interesting, but was for years considered obviously a Viking tower, even though it's built of cemented stone, and there was never cement used anywhere in the Viking world, even in Northern Europe, pretty much until the Romans used it, until the post-medieval period. For 1000 AD, the only other people who were using cement were the Aztecs, but no one says it was an Aztec tower. So, I'm guessing this has probably gone off track a little bit, but the Spirit Pond stones and all of these New England ones, I'd love to say that there was a good Viking site here in New England, but from a scientific, from an archaeological perspective, as opposed to I wish it were, no, there's no evidence. Sorry.
Nick Keenan says that he's heard the claim made that Columbus had access to Norse accounts that led him to believe the Atlantic was smaller than the others believed. Do you think that's credible?
Yeah, Nat, was it, or Nick? Nick, thanks for bringing that up. There was too much to put in this talk already, but the same guy who wrote that paper in 1984, named Bob McGee, published a really interesting article a few years after that, in which he made exactly that argument. The argument goes like this. Columbus, as a young navigator, left the Mediterranean for the first time in, I think, 1476, 1477, and got shipwrecked off the coast of Lisbon. He was then in Lisbon for a year or two, and Lisbon at that time in Portugal was King Henry the Navigator's center, and the place where all of the cool people who studied maps came. It was also the place that the sailors from Bristol and England were bringing salted cod down to Portugal to make bacalhau, because bacalhau had become not only important for the exploration ships that were going out from Portugal to feed the crews on the way to Africa, but also because of feast days and fast days in the Catholic calendar and fish for Fridays and that sort of thing. Bacalhau was the big thing. Well, the bacalhau all came from Iceland and from northern coast of Norway, but the Bristol fishermen were primarily fishing it, bringing it in from Iceland, where salted cod became the currency after textiles became less interesting in Europe. In 1477, according to Columbus's son's account of his father's life, Columbus got onto, because he was interested in knowing everything he could about the world, the ocean out to the west, he got hired onto one of these Bristol fishermen's fishing boats, and they went north beyond England to a place called Tile Island, or Thule, which was a medieval, post-medieval name for Iceland. And these crews were polyglot. There were people in them, we know from the records of them, who spoke Icelandic, who spoke Portuguese, who spoke French, who spoke English. They were sailors from all over the world. And Bob's argument was that by the time Columbus got to the north, and according to one side note in one of his books, he had seen a man who looked like a Chinese man lying dead or nearly dead in a skin boat in the middle of the North Atlantic, clearly describing an Eskimo who'd gotten, an Inuit who'd gotten separated out in the ocean. If it's true, McGee argues that Columbus, being a curious person who wanted to know about what was farther out, would have been listening to all the stories that the Norse, that the Icelanders, and these ships' captains were talking about areas to the west. He already had in mind that the world was a globe, and he knew that if you went north, the distance to get to the other side was a lot shorter than if you went at the equator. And so Bob's argument was, if Columbus knew that he wanted to go to Asia, the fastest way would be to go farther north on existing trade routes where you could stop in and replenish your stocks, then go the short distance around to Asia at the north and down. But he wouldn't have chosen that only if he knew there was something in the way. And if that something in the way was clearly not China or India. So Bob's argument is that because those crews knew, and remember, the Icelanders were still printing and rewriting and telling these stories about the Vinland sagas at that time. At the same time as Columbus was supposed to be there, they were drawing maps that showed areas to the west that showed Vinland. His argument is that Columbus could well have known about these things and therefore chose the most unlikely decision, which was to go around the world at the equator, the longest possible way, if he was right that the world was a sphere. It's an interesting argument. It makes some sense. It rests on the idea that what Columbus's son wrote about Columbus at a time when Columbus's son was also trying to gain a lot of notoriety, was telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about what his father had done and knew. But I like the idea. It's possible. It just is hard. It's even harder than some other things to prove. I hope that answers.
So that is the end of the questions, because you answered the last question that was there.
Okay.
So everyone, thank you. And especially Kevin, thank you. This was illuminating. And I second the comment of thank you for telling the story that, from a different perspective, and, talking about the First Nations people and the fact that they, pushed against the Vikings for so long.
I think when I think about that, that's the most important. There's a whole lot of importance about the Norse voyages westward. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's what I do, what I study, what I care about. But I do think that we do have to take a look at our preconceptions when we ask, was this important at all? When all we're thinking about is, was it important to European history?
Right. Yeah.
Because there were millions of people who for 18 generations were able to continue their lives and expand on what they were doing and live the best lives they could. Yeah. As a result of very small groups of people in the North who managed to repel that first episode of attempted colonization in the North. And I think this is the second talk I've given where I've talked about that, but I do think it creates a certain amount of discomfort for some Euro-American audiences because we are preconditioned to assume the Vikings were undefeated and undefeatable, and that European expansion was inevitable and impossible to have been defeated.
Yeah, there's definitely that.
Yeah, but it is the case. That's the story we're seeing at this point. And from the standpoint of the Greenland, I didn't want to talk about all the data from Greenland, but from Western Greenland, from that Western settlement area, there are 2 sites that have been excavated that we now have to rethink, because in one of them, the house is completely abandoned. But I think the dog and one of the livestock animals are lying dead on the floor at the end. They're complete skeletons there. And another one, a place called the Farm Under the Sand, was eventually buried under several meters of glacial sand that came out and froze everything in place. But that's not the reason it was abandoned. But it seems to have been abandoned so quickly that all the material for their loom, a place that has no wood resources, no wood there, where anything that large, which is what you made your household stuff on, is just lying on the floor along with everything else.
Yeah.
This is, if you had time to abandon or to leave, you'd take that with you.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful about reading the archaeological record for what it says, not for what we assume it would say. And I think we've done the latter for too long.
All right. Well,
Thank you all for staying on. Thank you for your patience. I hope you've got some things to think about. Sorry for going a little long, but as I say, it's a big story in 4 acts. So hope you don't need your money back. Take care.
goodbye, everyone.